All right, so welcome to this free prep hour. It is December 12th. I cannot believe it. I can't believe we're almost at the end of the year, 2021. It's about to be 2022, which, I keep seeing the jokes running around. I don't think I've fully processed 2020 yet. So the fact that it's about to be 2022 is interesting. So welcome. Tonight's free prep hour is going to be a verbal focused prep hour. We're going to talk critical reasoning and what I consider to be one of the most important areas of critical reasoning, the assumption family. So we're going to knock out several assumption family questions, but what I really want, you may have already been doing assumption family questions, which is great. We are going to work on a step-by-step checklist that even if you're taking the test in a few weeks, is something that you can begin to practice just to kind of like give you that extra edge, right? That extra edge. And so without further ado, we'll get started. My name is Whitney, or Whit. I'm a GMAT and GRE instructor based out of Durham, North Carolina. I live here with my 3 crazy dogs, and thankfully they're quiet tonight. So well, fingers crossed, we'll keep it that way. So tonight's lesson on critical reasoning. So just a little bit of a note, everything that we cover, all of the questions and materials are ours. So you can find them on our website, you can find them in our books, and you can find them right here. So critical reasoning is one of the 3 verbal question types on the GMAT. So we've got reading comprehension with like long passage and you answer several questions. We've got sentence correction where you read a single sentence and then you're working to choose the answer choice that has a sentence option that has no grammar issues and has clear meaning. And then there's critical reasoning, where it is a single little prompt, a single paragraph, and you'll be asked one specific question about it. You'll be asked to do things like strengthen it or draw your own conclusion. So in the world of critical reasoning, there are several question types. So argument structure question types are those that often have like bold, but there's also some called flaw and logic, but argument structure, traditionally your bold face. Then we have find the assumption. And so find the assumption is where we want to come up with what was the author thinking, but not telling us about. And that's going to be where we focus most of our attention tonight. But assumption, and then strengthen the argument or weaken the argument. So make it sound better, make it sound worse. Evaluate, the 4th of the question types we'll do tonight, is where we try to decide what would I want to know more about? What do I need more information about in order to best assess this argument? And then we've got inference, which means draw your own conclusion, and explain a discrepancy where it sounds like 2 facts or 2 outcomes seem to not make sense together. They seem to be at odds, and our job would be to introduce new information that makes them make sense. So structure is, an argument of its own. It's a type of its own. They're not the most common, but it might be worth kind of taking a glance at those. Inference and discrepancy are also sort of beasts of their own. And so what we'll focus on this evening is this, what we call assumption family. And an assumption family is basically everything that builds on the holes of an argument. So the author has laid out some number of facts and then tells you what his or her belief is. And usually they've skipped some steps in the middle. They've been a little bit lazy with how that's put together. So what we'll work on tonight is how best to deconstruct these arguments. And then I think even more importantly, how to begin to identify the very specific wrong answer types. Critical reasoning is a question on a standardized exam. And since the exam is standardized, that means that the questions have to be standardized, the language has to be standardized, and the logic behind what makes an answer right or wrong also has to be standardized. So if we can start to get into the head of the writer and understand what the plan was that they had for this is going to be wrong because, then we can do a better job eliminating answer choices. So that's going to be our kind of big focus tonight, is how do we do a better job of eliminating answer choices in our critical reasoning arguments, and in particular, this assumption family. So to get started with assumption family, we need to at least kind of nod to the four major parts of an argument. And now these are the four major parts of an argument that will be an assumption family argument. So the little paragraph in critical reasoning, if I'm answering any of the other question types, explain a discrepancy, inference or draw my own conclusion, or bold, the arguments may not look anything like this. It's only in these assumption family questions where we can guarantee that the argument will look like one of the following. So we're going to look at a couple of examples. In the world of critical reasoning, though, in order to build an argument, I need a conclusion. I have to believe something. I need to try and sell you something. And so our conclusions are the author's main and primary claim, right? It's what the author wants us to believe, often signaled with words like therefore or thus, as a result, and so. Now, on the way to trying to sell us something, the author will most likely give us information that he or she believes supports that conclusion. And so in this case, this would be language like because or since or for this reason, anything that makes the argument seem more likely. This is where we'll put those in the realm of premise. We then have the assumption itself. So an assumption is the one thing that's not on the screen. So this is the unstated information. So an assumption is something that the author believes or knows, but hasn't bothered to tell us. It is often the glue, it is the bridge that connects the premise, what we've been told, to the conclusion, what we're meant to believe. And there'll be some missing bits in there because our authors are always lazy. And so those missing bits are things that the author thought, I don't really need to tell them. Everybody knows that this is true. Everybody knows this. The problem is that that's not true. Not everybody knows what's in that author's head. And the author should have done a better job of explaining it. We then sometimes, not always, but sometimes we will end up with the opposite of a premise. And that's a counterpoint. Counterpoints will look and feel just like a premise. So they might be facts, they might be beliefs, but it's anything that's presented in the argument that will go against drawing the conclusion. And often the language we use are things like, even though this is true, although this is true, in spite of this thing. And so these are often what I would call caveat language. It's like, okay, I have to tell you this thing, but don't worry about that. The conclusion's still great. So that's our counterpoint. Notice that I didn't put anywhere on here language like but or however. And those are very big signal words, but they aren't signal words that indicate what that sentence is doing. Those are signal words, the but and the however, and we'll see them playing out here in just a moment. But the but and the however are signal words for the direction that the argument is going to take, not what the sentence itself means, whether the sentence is a premise or a counterpoint or a conclusion. All right, so we've got a conclusion. That's our main claim. We've got a premise. That would be anything that supports that. So I often like to think of these as, premise. I'll kind of jot this over here. Premise, therefore, conclusion. So our premises are the things that make us think a conclusion is true. A counterpoint might live kind of angrily over here. We'll just sort of drop it in the, counterpoint makes us very unhappy. We don't like the counterpoint. And then we have this nebulous assumption. So the assumption kind of lives out here. Its job is to either make us believe in the premise or believe that the premise connects to the conclusion. And so these assumptions are just swimming out in space, but we're apparently supposed to know them. The author of the argument assumes that we know them. And that is traditionally a pretty bad assumption on his or her part. Okay, so let's start with a really silly argument and let's identify what the pieces are. Let's take a moment to read. So it can be really helpful to think of this premise causes conclusion, or premise leads us to believe conclusion. So we have a Z phone and the revenues have gone up significantly. That sounds like a fact. That's something measurable. A conclusion is always going to be a belief. Right? So we'll just make that one little note over here that a conclusion is always a belief. So it is never fact. It is not something that we could look and see measured or written down. Right? It's something that is believed. So the Z phone's revenues increased in January. So fact. Therefore, good signal word for conclusion. Therefore, the phone must have generated, right? Not the phone did generate. The phone must have generated, meaning we're believing that this is the case, that the phone must have generated more profit during that window as well. So if we start to map it out, revenues increased, therefore profits clearly must have increased. How could they not have increased? Becomes this premise, therefore conclusion, where the premise is any of the stuff that is often factual, doesn't have to be, but its job is to lead us to believe the conclusion, whereas the conclusion itself is that biggest claim. It is never proven. It is something that needs support. It needs other information for us to believe that it's true. Okay, so this is our argument. Argument is a premise plus a conclusion. Now, technically, I'll argue that an argument isn't just a premise plus a conclusion, but the only way for it to really be an argument is to have this, sort of background cloud of assumption gluing it all together. All right, so we've got our Z phone. Our premise in this case is that revenues have increased significantly. And the conclusion is that profits clearly must have gone up as well, obviously, clearly. That must be the case. So if I were asked, for example, which of the following is an assumption, we might start to look around and think, what do we have to assume? What has to be true? So before we go there, I think that often for assumptions, we struggle when we first start to grapple with assumptions because it's not clear like what has to be true. What we need to be true. So instead, what I'd like to do is start with what would strengthen or support this conclusion. Right, so what are some things that would make me feel better about this conclusion? So this would be anything that just makes me, right, doesn't have to promise that the conclusion is true. It just makes the conclusion seem more likely. Okay, so strengthen equals more likely. And keep that in mind, and I'll kind of jot this down over here for us too. But so strengthen means more likely. It doesn't have to be a perfect sell, right? It may just subtly help. So if my revenue went up significantly, and I want to conclude, I want to believe that my profits also went up, what are some things that might strengthen my conclusion? Well, if costs didn't rise significantly during that same period, that would make me think that, our conclusion was potentially true, that our profits didn't go up by a whole bunch. So hopefully our profits did still go up. Hopefully our profits did still go up from what they once were. All right, a weaken would basically do the exact opposite. A weaken does not have to crush an argument. It just has to look at the sort of bridge, this connecting bridge, and it needs to chip away at one of the supports. It needs to make us feel like this bridge is a lot more weak. It doesn't need to destroy it. Right? A weaken would simply make something seem less likely. In this case, maybe it's that we say costs did rise significantly. Now, we're still not sure what significant meant, right? Revenues went up significantly. If costs rose significantly, my conclusion could still be true. It's just making me a little suspicious. If costs didn't rise significantly, that makes me think that my conclusion is potentially true, but it doesn't promise that my conclusion is definitively true. And I think what makes this now a little bit easier, or what will make this easier, is if we look at what an actual assumption would mean. So if a strengthen makes an argument more likely and a weaken makes an argument less likely, the assumption is something altogether more powerful. An assumption is something that makes the argument possible. It is completely necessary in order for us to draw this conclusion. In fact, without it, our conclusion would fail. Completely fail. So revenue goes up significantly. When I start to think about assumptions, I often think about bad news. So if I'm looking at an argument and I'm thinking, okay, if your revenues have gone up a bunch, what would stop you from having your profits go up? What would be the thing that would hurt you the most? What would guarantee that your conclusion isn't true? So I want y'all to type into the chat window for me. If you own Zphone and you know that your revenue went up like crazy, what could happen that would end up making it so that your profits didn't go up? That you weren't able to increase profit at all, even though revenue went up significantly? What might happen? Nice. I like that one. More ideas? Also good. I'm seeing a lot of the same thing. This is beautiful. So what happens, right? So again, with my assumptions, I often think, what's the bad news? So in the world of an assumption, this bad, worst news kind of thing, like, oh, the worst thing that could happen. What would ruin this story? If the costs went up so much that they outpaced or overtook the increase in revenue. If that happened, if our costs went up so much, so our costs could go up, they're allowed to go up, and our conclusion could still be true. But if our costs go up so much, right, that they ended up overtaking or offsetting our increase in revenue, then our conclusion would fail. So in order to write this as an assumption, I have to say that this didn't happen. That's my assumption. So in the world of the GMAT, traditionally, assumptions are what we call necessary, in that we just have to make sure that certain pieces are in place for our conclusion to even be possible. So assumptions are the things that make our arguments possible. We'll see more examples. So the last of this family is what we call evaluate. And if assumption is the most kind of significant, where we're saying an assumption has to be true in order for the argument to stand. And then we've got the strengthen and weaken that are like, well, a strengthen will make it a little better, a weaken could make it a little worse. Evaluate is the most neutral. The job of an evaluate answer is simply to ask for more information. And the answers to these questions are often written in question form. They're all about, what would you want to know more information about in order to determine whether this conclusion is any good? And in general, it will ask questions about the same type of information that your assumption, strengthen, or weaken questions would. In fact, any argument, little paragraph argument that's used for an assumption question could just as easily be used for a strengthen, a weaken, or an evaluate. So if we've been bantering around about cost, what's happening with cost, what's happening with cost, what's happening with cost, then we'd want to know more about cost. And so an evaluate is typically looking for a piece of information that can behave like a switch, in the sense that if you answer the question in the affirmative, it would strengthen the question or strengthen the argument. But if you answered the question the other way, it would completely destroy the argument. So we want something that's such a catalyst that the littlest shift in the response to that question or that piece of information would fully change how we feel about the problem. So for example, did the costs rise significantly? That would be a great question. There's our evaluate. Did the cost rise significantly? No, they didn't rise significantly. Boom, that would act as a strengthen. However, if I answered it in the exact opposite way, oh no, yeah, cost totally rose significantly. That would weaken. So the thing to highlight though is that the evaluate, the answer choice itself would look like this question. The answer choice itself would say, which of the following, right, would be most useful to compare in evaluating the argument? Answer choice B says, did the cost of did Z-phone's cost rise significantly? Oh yes, that's very important. We should ask that question, right? That's very, very important. That's one we need to know. Okay, so let's kind of run through this series again, but with another question. Let's run through, and I'm going to let y'all practice an actual, like a little partial question. Okay, a partial question. So here we go. Here is an argument. It's got 3 answer choices. Let's take 2 minutes. I'll set a timer and then privately share with me what you think the correct answer All right. If you have not given me your answer, do so. I've got an answer from a few folks. I'm still waiting on 1 or 2 more. So hit me with it. Okay. Nice. All right, so let's start by deconstructing our argument, or actually let's start by deconstructing our step-by-step process. So what I'd like for us to do from this point forward is to really adhere to a sort of 4-step process of thought. So we talk about in a lot of our books, this 4-step process of identify the question and so on, and we're going to build it around this structure. But instead of just saying, here's what I do, this 4-step process, I want you to constantly be saying, what do I think? What should I be thinking in this moment? So let's start with step 1. So step 1 is ID the question type. Now, in general, it's most important for me that we identify the question family or type. So if I am in the assumption family, it's okay that I acknowledge assumption family. But it can be helpful to fully see the question type itself. So we'll start right in the middle. which of the following, if true, best supports, now we have to be careful, which of the following best supports the conclusion given above, meaning the answer choices are going to support the argument above it. That is a strengthen. So this is our strengthen question. Now, in all assumption family questions, what we do under ID the question type is the exact same. It's the exact same. So once I've ID'd, this is a strengthen, what I want to say to myself is, my job is to find the holes in this argument. That's it. So it doesn't matter if I'm strengthening or weakening or evaluating. In the world of assumption family, I want to acknowledge, okay, this is strengthen, but my job as I read is to find the holes in the argument. And in fact, the crucial first step is always, and this is true for this type of argument, this is not true for other question types, but for the assumption family question, when I move to step 2, deconstruct the argument, what I want is, before I do anything else, I'm looking for the conclusion. So that's all I care about. I'm here to find the conclusion. And so I actually read this in more than one pass, meaning I read it more than once. So on my first pass through, my job is only to find the conclusion. I then read it a second time to build the argument around it. Now, I may or may not jot down a few notes here. This isn't always, I'm not somebody who always takes notes while I'm working through a critical reasoning argument. But traditionally, I will at least sketch out a bit of a map before I move into the next steps. So first pass, I'm going to find my conclusion. So as I read the argument, I'm looking for key language. Pueblo Bonita is this large building. Here's where it's located. People have thought about this place as a palace for a very long time. So people believe that, but it's a fact. The fact that people believe it, right? That's a fact. So me saying archaeologists and historians have long considered this place a palace, I'm stating a fact. They've long considered it that. However, so when we hear the words however or but, I don't want to think negative or positive. I just want to think we're changing direction. So you just told me, author, that archaeologists and historians have been under the conception that this was a palace for God knows how long. However, meaning something has changed. So however, researchers haven't really found any what we would call evidence of a palace. Also a fact. They went out, they looked, they didn't find it. Gold, jewels, whatever, luxury goods. Yeah. Therefore, boom, here's our conclusion. Therefore, it is more likely that this place was a religious center than apparently a palace. That's my conclusion. So now I want to take a moment to sit with my conclusion. The author believes that PB was a religious center, whatever shorthand, right? PB was a church, a mosque, whatever you want to call it. Right, whatever shorthand makes sense in your mind. So PB was a religious center. Why would the author think that? So I don't want to just reread sentences. I want to put the argument in my own words. And what I mean by that is I'm not just going to read the sentence and use synonyms. I'm literally trying to make it my own. So the author thinks PB is a church or a religious center, however you want to kind of shortcut it. So I'll say PB religious. Actually, I'll drop this in over here. So this Pueblo Bonito place was religious. My question is like, why? Well, because it didn't have the stuff a palace would have. So it didn't have palace stuff. Oh, really? Okay, it didn't have palace stuff. So we went from thinking it was a palace to thinking it was a religious center simply because researchers didn't find gold and jewels. Like, if that were the case, if researchers just hadn't found gold and jewels, couldn't we have just said, therefore, it's probably not a palace? But the author said, well, that wasn't entertaining enough. I'm not just going to say, well, there's no jewels, so it's probably not a palace. There's no jewels, so let's call it a religious center, with no evidence whatsoever to support religious center. So I'm starting to look for the holes. Like, this seems like a pretty crummy argument. So now I will move to step 3. What I want to do, and this becomes really critical, is in step 3, we call this in our books, and in our courses, pause and state the goal. But this is where I actually do end up jotting something down on my paper. What I'm trying to do is I'm marrying my understanding of the argument. So I want to combine understanding of the argument with what the question type wants me to do. So this is a strengthen, right? It's a strengthen. And so what it wants me to do is to show that, yeah, this place probably is a religious center. So here's where I might jot this down on my paper. And I would say something like my goal, or however I want to like circle it or highlight it. I want to show that, like, yes, PB is like likely to be, right? So likely to be religious. And whatever little notation I want to use in my really terrible handwriting right now. Yeah, PB is likely to be religious. That's my goal. I'm looking for an answer that supports that. This becomes even more important when we deal with weekend, because often weekend we need to kind of like translate. So now here comes the real kind of like headspace, is I want to now, when I eliminate, I'm moving to the answer choices, eliminate wrong to right is kind of my goal. I am looking for common wrong answers. Common wrong answers. Now, first things first, I don't eliminate anything. I don't eliminate anything, or let's put it this way. I keep anything confusing or that you're unsure about. And I like to say this to myself, don't fight it. I am not going to spend a bunch of time fighting with an answer choice that doesn't make sense to me. If I read an answer choice, it's not entirely clear, I'll go to the next one. And like, I'll just move through them until I find something that does feel eliminatable. It does feel eliminatable. And here's why. As soon as I start eliminating answer choices, I run the risk of eliminating the right answer. And as soon as I've eliminated the right answer, the fact is that any more time I spend is likely wasted, because now I'm going to be fighting answer choices. Like, well, is it this one? Is it this one? Is it D? Is it E? Is it D? Is it E? When the correct answer was A, and that's already gone. I'm not even looking at it anymore. So what usually eats up time for my students is when they're down to 2 and they're fighting back and forth and back and forth. Well, we don't want to do that anyways. I want to make a decision. Even if I'm not entirely sure, I still want to pick something, but I certainly don't want to be going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between 2 answers that neither of them are right. So I'd rather not eliminate anything. In fact, my mental clock of the answer choices doesn't even really start until I've eliminated the first answer choice. So I have all the incentive in the world to just like read answer choices and see what I think. That said, I am absolutely 100% of the time going to write the letters A, B, C, D, E on my paper. In this case, we have just the 3. So I'll write my letters, A, B, C on my paper, and I'm going to eliminate as I go. I'm not going to keep track of that in my head. So another ancient building known to have been a religious center was found in a nearby canyon. I mean, I guess that would say that there are religious centers nearby, so that religious centers are allowed, I guess. So we'll leave it. B, religious centers often possess artifacts made of gold or other precious metal. Wait, what? But Pueblo Bonita doesn't have any of those things. So let's start to now track what are common wrong answer types for this world of strengthen, weaken, assumption, and evaluate. So one of the most common in this family, especially for strengthen and weaken rather, is the other. So what I mean by other is that we've been asked to strengthen or weaken, and the answer choice does the opposite thing. Right, does the entire opposite thing. So we'll start with that. We have an other wrong answer type. Or excuse me, not other, opposite. So this would weaken when we're supposed to strengthen, and vice versa. Okay, so that would be B. B here is a weaken. Because if this is true, then it seems very unlikely that Pueblo Bonita would be religious. PB doesn't have artifacts like gold or, it doesn't have luxury. So this would actually be a weaken when what we're trying to do is strengthen. So that's the only one I'd feel super comfortable eliminating up till now on my list. B. C, during this time frame, large buildings were generally either palaces or religious centers. This might seem weird. However, the author did make quite the leap from saying everybody thought it was a palace, but then we just didn't find any luxury goods, so I guess we're going to call it a religious center. Like, where did religious center come from? Couldn't it have been many other things? It could have been housing for who knows, right? It could have been a site where people worked. So the fact that they jumped from Pueblo, from it being a palace to a religious center, that's a leap. And this would seem to explain that leap, that if during this window of time, for the most part, large buildings had to be one or the other, then if we stop thinking something is a palace, we are going to begin thinking that it is a religious center. So then where does A fit in? And so A, I would plug in to unclear direction. So this is another one where it's like, okay, I think it might be relevant, but I'm not entirely sure if it strengthens or weakens. So it seems relevant, but it might strengthen or weaken. I'm not sure. And so in this case, the fact that there are religious centers in these neighboring canyons might make it more likely that Pueblo Bonito could be a religious center. It might also be the case that if there's already a religious center like right next door, then maybe it's less likely that this is one. It's also like, I don't even know if that neighboring canyon is part of the same group of people who were inhabiting Chaco Canyon, because this neighboring canyon may have been an entirely different group of indigenous peoples. So it's really unclear how this would impact. And so we'll call this, instead of an opposite, this becomes the unclear. So we'll think of this as an unclear direction or unclear impact. It might seem relevant, might be relevant maybe, but it's not entirely clear how. But during the time frame in question, in this case, our correct answer is C. I'm a much bigger fan of, again, eliminating wrong to whatever's left over. But how does this answer choice help us? It helps us understand the quick switch from, yeah, we thought it was a palace. Now, all of a sudden, we think it's a religious center without any positive evidence for a religious center. Okay. So let's keep adding to our list of common wrong answers. This is certainly not the only two. There's quite a few, actually. So again, keep reminding yourself that these are standardized questions. And so the wrong answers also have to be standardized. Now, just to kind of round out using this Chaco Canyon example, we can look at this exact same argument in the sort of universe of assumption. So what might we be assuming here? A different assumption could totally be that we assume that tomb raiders don't come or didn't come already and take everything. They looted the place and took everything. Again, when we're starting to think about assumption, I want to ask the question, what would have been bad? Right? Like, what could have happened? What could be true that could make us really think that this conclusion is bad? And one thing could be if there were luxury goods there, but they just got stolen. So this whole argument becomes a mess because we're only making any of these claims based on the absence of luxury goods. But maybe these luxury goods are gone, not because they weren't ever there, but because someone stole them. So what do we need to assume? We need to assume that tomb raiders have not taken them. What about a weakener? Well, if I wanted to weaken this, so I've strengthened it by showing that it would make sense that if some place isn't a palace, it must be a religious center. How might I weaken it? Well, I might say something about the fact that luxury goods were things that would have decomposed. So here's another reason why we don't find luxury goods. We're not finding luxury goods not because tomb raiders in this case, although that could be the case, right? Tomb raiders were common in this area during this period or what have you. But we could also say luxury goods during this period weren't durable. They weren't gold and gems like we might be thinking. Luxury goods were things that would have broken down and decomposed. And by the time we went to look, they'd be gone. So that doesn't ruin the argument, but it certainly undermines it. Other ways we could strengthen this argument. We could show that similar structures that had little evidence of luxury goods were found to be religious centers. Now we're saying that structures that looked very much alike, that also didn't have luxury goods, had all of these things in common. Now these things are more likely to be religious centers. Now we're putting enough pieces together that it's like, okay, I can see how this would impact. I can see how this would impact. Okay. So let's try it again. We'll try to strengthen again, and we're going to run through a whole series with another little argument. So again, first job, identify the question type. So take a moment. It's here in the middle. I want you to walk through each step. And then our job is to deconstruct. So if this is a strengthen, which the following most strongly supports this plan, I now want to find holes in the argument. And step one, I'm going to go find the conclusion. So we'll take about 45 seconds or so to read the argument. First pass through is just to find the conclusion. Our second pass is to build the argument around it. So again, I'll put about a minute on the clock for us to deconstruct. All right. So we've got a lot of beliefs kind of running around. Our city is known for its ability to cater to tourists. That sounds sort of like a fact. If students choose not to study, our tourism industry will decline alarmingly. Now that feels like a conclusion. That feels like a belief. If students choose not to study foreign languages in the way they are right now, then we are in trouble. Okay. That very likely could be our conclusion. So I'll keep reading just to make sure. I propose, says the manager, I propose to offer a bunch of discounts, and I'm going to give those discounts to anyone who develops fluency in a foreign language. These discounts will thus safeguard our tourism industry in the future. Okay, so that's another belief. So facts so far, our city is known to cater to tourists in their native language, and I'm going to offer some tuition discounts to anyone who becomes fluent in a foreign language. Okay, those are the two facts. The other two things, if students stop studying language as much as they used to, we're in trouble, and my discounts are going to save us. I often like to think about the timeline here. My discounts are about to save us is this is the conclusion, right? This is our it's all going to be terrible, but I can fix it. Here's how. And so this is how I plan to fix it. That's our conclusion here. Our city manager wants us to believe, or does himself believe or herself believe, that the fees, the discounts will save the tourist industry. Hooray. Right? And how is that? Well, it seems like we don't have students speaking the foreign, or we don't have students going to school and learning these languages as much as they were. And so if we give them enough money, they'll go get fluent, right? So this is like the theory in the background. So if this is my conclusion, I might jot down a note to myself that's like, if we give them money, they'll study. And then our industry, our tourism is saved. So we could focus on the discounts, right? We could write it that way. I just want to have a note that helps me understand what the argument is I'm going to give y'all money. You're going to get fluent. I'm going to save my tourism industry. Excellent. Now, what is this business about? If students choose not to study a foreign language, we're in trouble. This is a setup. It's helping explain or make the argument seem more realistic. And it is the motivation by which our city manager is deciding to go for tuition discounts. So the city manager is like, I'm going for tuition because I believe this thing. I believe that students are the reason why we're in trouble. And they have to save us, right? Okay. So now my job, pause and state the goal. Author thinks that city manager thinks that if we give them money, they'll become fluent. And I should say that they'll become fluent. And then our tourism is saved, right? Like that's my little city manager, fancy city manager. And my job is to support that, is to show that he's right. She's right. Throwing money at the students is going to work. So in this case, I might make the note to myself, throwing money at students will work. That's my sort of goal. An answer choice will make it seem like one of the answers will make it seem like throwing money at the students will work. Great. So let's go through the answer choices. I'll give you all three of them. We'll take about a minute and you send me your answer privately. Which one you think most makes us think that throwing money at the students is going to work? And don't forget, send me your answer privately when you think you've got it. Got a couple answers coming in. Very cool. Nice. All right, so let's run through them together. Foreign language speakers could be recruited from other locales to work in this city. Well, hold on. If that's true, if this is an option, that might not be great. That might not be right. Like, I'm trying to say that this plan is going to work. Now, that said, one of the things I want to highlight, one of the common wrong answer types in this world is what I often call like the sort of, I call this the pig's fly argument. I'll just leave it at that. So here's why I call this the pig's fly. Wrong answer. So let's imagine that I'm going to be in a debate with a friend. We're going to have a like formal debate. We get up on stage, and I get up and I say, well, if pigs could fly, they would likely need a lot of speed in order to get lift. And given their weight, would likely struggle and more hover than fly. That's my argument. And it would be totally acceptable if my friend came back and she said to me, well, okay, hold on. Pigs are shaped very much like bumblebees. And since bumblebees have no trouble flying, your arguments are based on bad physics. And that would be perfectly acceptable. This would be a perfectly acceptable rebuttal to my argument that if pigs could fly, here's what it would likely look like. And her response was, well, your physics is wrong. In fact, portly little bumblebees with itty bitty bitty little wings fly just fine. Strangely enough. And so why couldn't a pig fly? Notice that my friend didn't come back and say to me, Whitney, pigs can't fly. But pigs can't fly. Here's why that's important. Because in the world I set forth, I said, if they can, if pigs can fly, here's what I believe. Given that I've said that now, given I've now claimed that, you have to believe it with me. If pigs could fly, here's what I think. You don't get to go, yeah, no, pigs don't fly. We're going to talk about something else. You don't get to do that. You're only allowed to address what I think happens given this hypothetical or this plan. And that's what's happening here, is that this city manager is proposing tuition discounts to students and saying that this is going to work. My job now is to sit in the city manager's argument of pigs and they're flying, or of discounts and those discounts working. So the only thing I can go after is whether I think the discounts will or will not work. I don't get to tell the city manager that he shouldn't have been going after discounts at all, that there was a better alternative option. I just get to tell him if discounts are going to be effective or not. That my hands are tied. That's all I've got. So the pigs fly brings in like an alternate suggestion, right? It says we should think or do something else. And essentially it doesn't stick to the argument, to the plan or belief of the argument. And so great, maybe foreign language speakers could be recruited, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about now is whether the discounts are going to work. So this becomes that, like, this is our pigs fly, and they fly, right? Sorry, but pigs fly in this world. We're going to give them a tuition discount. What I'd like to know is that going to work? B, it's confusing, but even if the rate of foreign language study increases, these discounts are not going to get students to study the correct languages. So students are going to be like, even if they start studying a lot more foreign language, they're going to study all the wrong languages. They're all going to study Latin. This is another example of our opposite. We wanted to strengthen, this is going to weaken. However, a recent study found that students in the area cited price as their reason for enrolling. Well, then, or for not enrolling. So that sounds like we're going after the right intervention. We're going after the intervention of price because they're citing price. If they had cited something like quality or location or availability of classes, then this would be a weaken. If a recent study cited anything other than price, we should be wondering why we're going after a price intervention. But in this case, they said it's price. And so it's like, perfect, that would fit beautifully. Right, let's take the same argument, exact same argument, but instead of a support, let's see what happens when we weaken. Now, in this case, we're going to weaken except. So what that means is that there will be, in this case, with 3 answer choices, there will be 2 weaken answer choices. My job is to find the 2 weaken answer choices and eliminate them and pick which one's left. So let's take 45 seconds or so and send me what you think doesn't weaken. Interesting. All right, so answer choice A, a majority of schools are already offering deeply discounted tuition and or full scholarships. That sounds like we should not we should not be going after cost because it's all mostly free anyways. So this does weaken, and so we would eliminate it. Right. In this case, I'm looking for 2 weekends. So my goal is really clear. I need 2 answers that make it seem like throwing money is a bad idea. It's a very, very bad idea. And in this case, this would be a terrible idea. Why would I throw money at a problem that already is free? That doesn't make any sense. A neighboring city has announced plans to offer very high salaries to bilingual workers. Wait a minute. Maybe I'll leave it, but I do have this sort of thought that what happens if I put these folks through school? I give them these big giant tuition discounts so that they can come to the school for free to low cost, so that they become bilingual. They become bilingual, and then they move to the neighboring city that is paying bilingual employees a lot of money. That would be very bad. So I'm going to leave that. Let's see what C says. So most students who take advantage of the tuition discounts will work to develop fluency by means other than their school classes. And so I just want to check. So I'll double check on the argument. The argument says, I'm going to give discounts to students who develop fluency. It doesn't say, I'm going to offer tuition discounts to students who study a foreign language in my school and only in my schools. It says, if you go get fluent, I'm going to give you money. So do I actually care how you get yourself fluent? No, I don't actually care. So it turns out B actually also weakens. Why? Because an assumption would be that, students stick around after, they graduate. If students graduate and leave, we're in trouble. In this case, it's actually answer choice C that is our correct answer. Answer choice C is our correct answer. Okay. Because I don't care how you develop fluency. You can develop fluency by living with an international family. You can fly to Central America and live with a family for 1 week a month, 2 weeks a month, and become fluent in Spanish if you'd like. Or you can move to China and learn Mandarin, right? I don't care. I'm going to give you a tuition discount, so you get to go to my school for really cheap, as long as you become fluent. All right, so now let's look at the hybrid of these two. Let's look at which of the following would be most useful in sort of evaluating. My goal now is money a good intervention here, right? That's what I'm looking for. What would I want to know more about? What would help me understand whether money is a good intervention? And then pull in what you think for this one. Nice, very nice. So whether I'm allowed to register early, that's an unclear impact, right? Like I have no idea how that would impact whether it's going to be useful. Same for how far in advance. But knowing whether they're going to use them to study the most common languages spoken by our tourists, that matters. And so correct answer B, very nice, very nice. All right, so one more question type for this same argument, just so we can see assumption. And let's add another couple of wrong answer types to the list. Here we go, give this one a shot. Very nice. Very nice. So do I need retaining the city's reputation to be important for students? No, what I need is I need money to be an important concern for most students. If the city's reputation had been important, great, that would be nice to have, but it's not necessary. Ditto for C. While it would be cool if students who would have studied a technical field change their mind, like that would be awesome. That's a nice to have. It's not a requirement. What would have been a requirement here is that students will study a foreign language commonly spoken by tourists. That is something that has to be true. We need that to be true. But the way it's written, it's nice to have. It's not necessary. So why answer choice B? Well, the students who develop fluency are not gonna move away. That's good, because if they do move away, we're in trouble. So a good assumption eliminates a bad possibility. And in this case, students leaving would be a very bad possibility. And so it's quite good that in this world, it eliminates that. So let's apply all of these things with one more example. Here we go. And we'll do this. I'll give you the full count up clock. So normally we would take about 2.5 or 2 minutes, and up to about 2.5 minutes for these on test day. All right. So which of the following would most seriously weaken an explanation of a parent's higher fat intake? Okay. So I'm looking for the holes in this argument, in this case, so that I can exploit them. My first pass through is to find the conclusion. And so a recent study demonstrated that parents living with kids consume nearly 5 more grams of fat per day on average than adults that don't live with children. Okay, that's a fact. The higher fat intake among these parents is probably attributable to, okay, this is a belief, I'm already there. They're snacking on the pizza and cookies that tend to be plentiful in households with children. I'll just tell you this right now. I'm in a household without children and I have plentiful cookies and pizza. So I don't like this argument already, but they think that parents have this additional or parents are getting these extra 5 grams of fat because they're eating junk food, because there's more junk food in houses with kids. So the conclusion is sort of this, like, houses with kids have more junk food equals more grams of fat for the parents. Okay, great. Okay, great. So pause and state the goal. I want to weaken that. So here's where I take a moment and I then say to myself, okay, this argument thinks that it's these pizzas and cookies that are getting these extra grams. These adults are getting extra grams of fat. I'm not going to take issue with the fact that parents are eating 5 grams more than non-parent people, adults in a home without kids. I can't take issue with that because that's a fact. What I am going to take issue with is that it's the pizza and the cookies. So my goal here is to show that it might not be the fault of the pizza and the cookies. It might be something else. A, on average, households with kids spend $15 more per week on pizza and cookies than do households with children. This is an opposite answer because this strengthens. This is the opposite of what we want. B, households with kids purchase much more whole milk, which has a high fat content. So much more than do households without children. Well, I want to show that it's not pizza and cookies that are doing this. This could be a good piece of evidence. This would say, actually, it's probably the whole milk. It's not pizza and cookies. It could be the whole milk. So I'll leave it. So whole milk stays on the board. All right, so now we look at C. Children consume most of the pizza and cookies in any given household. Ooh, that sounds pretty good too. Because if kids are eating the pizza and cookies, okay. D, parents ought to set a good example for their children in dietary choices as in other matters. So we're adding a new wrong answer type. And this applies to all of our assumption family questions, including assumption. We've got the motivation trap. So this is something that it would explain why the author cares about this issue at all, but doesn't support or weaken the conclusion itself. So why does our author care? Why is our author talking? Well, maybe because parents ought to set a good example, but like that doesn't tell me whether pizza and cookies are where these extra 5 grams of fat are coming from or if they're not. And so a motivation trap. This might also be the wrong answer if what would be the best way to put this? If let's say we wanted, in the last problem that we did with the city, right? The city manager, a motivation trap might be an answer choice that talks about, well, maybe we don't need the tourist industry anyways, or tourism brings, 75% of the revenue to our town, right? Or we start to explain why tourism really is important, or maybe why we shouldn't care about tourism. But if we're looking at like, okay, well, why did the city manager want to do this in the first place? Well, because tourism is important, but that doesn't explain whether the plan is going to work or not. All right, E is one of the other kind of like famous wrong answer types. And this is what I call an unnecessary distinction. Or extreme. So this might be where it's like, well, some students do study the language. Some students won't. It's like, well, that's okay. Not all students have to. It's okay that some students don't. In this case, not all parents living with kids consume more grams of fat than do adults living without children. Okay, great. Some don't, but the question says on average. So I don't actually care that some do and some don't. That doesn't hurt my argument at all. So it's often this language of like some that'll do it. We have one other Right. So it's, in this case, it might be claiming that some members of a group are different. And so we shouldn't necessarily draw some conclusion, but it's like some, if they said most, that'd be different, but some. There is one other one. We haven't seen an example of it tonight, but it's actually one of the ones that I think is easiest to spot. And this is the one that we would call other. And other would be anything that brings in a whole new argument, which is, in this case, it would be maybe saying something along the lines of adults, parents living with children also burn an additional 500 calories per day on average, compared to, maybe it's because they're chasing their kids around, I don't know. The point is, like, okay, great, it's a comparison, but we're just talking about these 5 grams of fat. Like, why are we now talking about exercise? So other is often bringing in some other argument. We're talking about something other than grams of fat. We're now talking about a comparison other than parents with and without kids, that kind of thing. So we're down at these 2. And it turns out that C is kind of part of the same unnecessary distinction. It doesn't matter that children consume most of the pizza and cookies. If there's still pizza and cookies left for parents in numbers greater than those for the adults that don't live in houses with kids, then we're still okay. The argument is still okay. And so why B? B gives us an alternate explanation. If we want to show that it might not be the fault of pizza and cookies, then we need to show that something else might be to blame. And in this case, it might be whole milk. And so the correct answer is answer choice B. So what I'd like to encourage you to do, oh, and I should say, there is one other wrong answer type. And this one's easy enough to just describe. And it's what I call a code switch. And this is when an argument goes from percent to number, for example, or from number of times, so maybe prevalence, to severity. So we talk about how often something happens, and then one of the answer choices talks about how bad each incidence is. And so it's when they're trying to get us to mix up terminology. So the passage only talks, or the argument only talks about percentages, and then answer choices bring up numbers. Or the argument only talks about how bad each instance, oh, it's terrible, the leak is awful. And then an answer choice talks about how frequent the leaks are. So anytime we've got this like code switch, so to speak, that will also indicate a wrong answer in this family of assumption families. So what I'd strongly encourage you to do is maybe grab a screen grab, particularly of these wrong answer choices. And I'll drop a little image of this into the chat. Maybe, I'm not sure that it'll let me, but grab a little screen grab of it. And then next time you start working on some critical reasoning, make yourself go really slow and see if you can categorize every wrong answer and not just say things like, oh, that's out of scope. Oh, that's, that doesn't matter. Try and be really specific about which actual wrong answer category it fits into. Y'all, it has been a pleasure. As a quick reminder, we have free prep hours a couple of times a month. So by all means, go on the site, sign up for them. Come again. If you have not already, sign up for a free practice test on our site, manhattanprep.com. You can also sign up for a free trial of any of our classes. We are, in fact, starting to do in-person classes. Right now, I am not sure that we are allowing trials in our in-person sessions, but you are absolutely welcome to attend as a trial for any of our online courses. And otherwise, thank you so much for coming. If you have any questions or curious about anything we've got going on, check us out on our website. Otherwise, have a lovely evening. and a lovely couple of weeks before here we are at the end of the year. So it's been a pleasure. Again, my name is Whitney, and I have enjoyed very much working with all of you this evening. Good luck on your exams for those of you taking it at the beginning of the year, like several mentioned to me. And for those of you that have a longer study plan, good luck. Stay strong. Keep the motivation. Bye, y'all.